Good evening, everyone, and welcome to one of the two final sessions of our 2020 NPA conference. A session on collaboration and integration with general practice is running simultaneously, but all 9 sessions that we've done will be available on replay, so you won't miss out. This is the first virtual conference from the NPA, and so the team are very keen to have your feedback on how you find the experience. So I'm Andrew Lane, Chair of the NPA. I've been on a few of these already, as you've probably seen. Some of you may well have joined the opening session on Monday that heard from the Secretary of State on Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock. And Matt spoke for 10 minutes and answered a number of questions from participants, and I can see some great quotes coming through on Twitter. Matt said he wants NHS pharmacies to play an even more active role in clinical services, taking pressure off GPs and improving care. He also said community pharmacies are deeply entrenched in the communities they serve. The clue is in the name. And he said he wants to see our NHS pharmacies play a critical role in the biggest flu vaccination programme in history as we head towards winter. And this is promising for community pharmacies, but we need to be supported to meet the demands. However, as you're only too aware, money is very tight out there, and more than half of the English pharmacies are losing money. We will need the Chancellor to find the funds to support community pharmacies in England, or we will see many more close. And I think I've been quoted many times saying that. The NPA has started doing some thinking internally about the pharmacy contract. The 5-year deal, which runs from April 2019 to March 2024, offers a degree of certainty, but declining income in real terms, with the cash sum fixed at 2.592 billion per annum. We've been asking ourselves and experts in the field some pretty fundamental questions. Is the current contract fit for purpose? Can we maintain a sustainable model for independence with the current margin-based system? Are there other ways to fund community pharmacy that appropriately reward investment that would deliver a sustainable income stream for business owners? What model would allow us to operate to our strengths in a competitive market? And I want to stress that we're still at the very early stage in this thinking. Different models would bring risks as well as new opportunities, but both extensive strategic thinking and detailed business modelling would be required before we would be comfortable advocating any change. But it's absolutely right that we ask these questions. With half the sector in deficit, we would not be doing our job if we didn't explore, research, evaluate, communicate, and consult with our members on what different models may exist. We'd encourage all our members to talk to us about this, large and small. And if you have a new model that you would like to propose, or you think that the status quo is the most viable option, come and talk to the group that we've set up to investigate this and influence the debate. So on this evening's session, we'd like to give you a flavour of some of the ideas we're listening to. And we've got a great lineup for you. I should say at the start that if you want to contribute questions to any of the panel, please submit them online as we go. And my colleagues and I will pick them up and ask as many as we can. And please use the chat function rather than putting your hand up for that. I'm sure many of you are now Zoom experts and need no help at all in doing exactly that. First up, we've got Gary Myers. He's an NPA member and a regional rep on PSNC. Gary's a partner in a GP practice and has a really integrated clinical model operating between the pharmacy and the surgery. And Gary's a strong proponent of a more clinical model, and we look forward to hearing his views. Gary's actually not able to join us this evening, but he's recorded his views. Finn McCall is also joining us, and he's another well-known independent community pharmacy owner. Some of you may have seen him at the Sigma conference. He's an NPA member and regional representative on the PSNC from the Northwest. Richard Brown is also joining us. He's the Chief Officer of Avon LPC, and many of you have probably seen Richard again this past week. Jay Patel is the Executive Director of Day Lewis, an NPA member and a non-CCA multiple representative on PSNC. And Jay is also not able to join us, but has provided a video link to his views. So it's over to Gary, who'll segue straight into Finn. So hopefully you'll get that recording straight away.
Okay, good evening. My name's Gary Myers. I'm Managing Director of Shires Pharmacies Limited. I'm an NPA member. I'm also a PSNC committee member, and for my sins, a recently qualified independent prescriber. I wanted to talk to you this evening about some of the policy contexts that are informing a new business model that's under development, and to try to sort of set the scene for my colleague Finn McCall, that's actually going to talk to you about the model itself and how we propose it might actually work. So moving on, the first thing is to talk about the existing contractual framework and something that's often referred to as a perverse incentive. The existing contractual framework essentially is volume and margin driven. This means the more you dispense, the more you earn. It's largely been unchanged since the inception of the NHS. It is in some ways, or is deemed to be, an item of service-based payment system, which means all pharmacies have got an incentive to dispense on the basis that if you dispense more items, you earn more money. But in addition to that, a large component of the contractual framework revolves around the earning of up to 800 million in retained margin. And this system encourages pharmacies to engage in what we call competitive procurement, whereby they use market forces and shopping around to try and buy generics at the best possible prices and effectively to undercut the reimbursement price and maximize the amount of margin they can earn and therefore retain. However, this system is deemed by the rest of the NHS to be, as I say, what we call a perverse incentive. It has historically often brought us as independent contractors into conflict with the local NHS, such as Medicines Management Team, CCG Finance, and practice budget holders. Because whereas we might want to maximise our income by dispensing as many items as possible, with that comes upward pressure on local NHS drug budgets. And so we're pulling in one direction, and they obviously are trying to reduce drug cost and therefore dispensing activity. The other issue with this perverse incentive, it introduces what some people term a supply conflict of interest. This means that in a situation whereby an individual might be able to prescribe as well as supply, there is a direct conflict of interest, because that might tend to cause you to want to prescribe in order to generate additional income. So, and that historically has tended to ensure that the NHS wishes to separate the prescribing and dispensing functions. Obviously, an item of service-based system, there is a tendency for item of service-based systems to generate excessive activity to maximise income, as I've said above. Now, in the case of acute trusts and hospitals, this was found to be working against the interests of the NHS in terms of generation of such unnecessary activity, and that has caused the rest of the NHS to want to move to a system which uses capitated budgets. So moving on to the next slide, let me talk a little bit more about existing perverse incentives. First of all, this is something that's not new thinking. The idea of perverse incentives and why it was that pharmacies actually get paid like this has been queried as long as 37 years ago by a Hansard article. There's also the World Health Organization, who compiled a report recently on the over-medicalization of developed healthcare systems, where the idea that medicines are often overused in westernized healthcare systems is becoming a global problem. We've also got against this a recent quite influential paper by Ben Goldacre and co on dispensing practices with a financial conflict of interest. And in that report, Ben Goldacre demonstrated that in actual fact, commercial influences where prescribing and dispensing take place under the same roof can actually influence prescribing behaviours. There's also a lot of other evidence around influences of prescribing. It's something that's often researched, and understanding what shapes GP prescribing choices is well understood. And as I said, in Ben Goldacre's case, it's successfully proven that commercial considerations do actually influence prescribing. We've also got the Eden Project. That's the English Deprescribing Network, which is the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer's solution to this particular problem around over-reliance of medicines in healthcare systems. We also had the initiative around structured medication reviews, which are replacing the now decommissioned MURs. With SMRs, where a clinical pharmacist has access to the clinical records of a patient, deprescribing where clinically appropriate is a key component. We've also got the issue of independent prescribing in community pharmacy, which in some ways comments made by NHS England appear to have actively discouraged. We've also got the changes to undergraduate training programs, where it's the intention of NHS England to ensure that all pharmacists that graduating from the schools of pharmacy are licensed to prescribe by 2026. So what about the current existential threats to independent community pharmacy as a result of the existing contractual framework? Firstly, everybody knows about primary care networks and the desire of such networks to recruit technicians and pharmacists into primary care networks and GP practices. It is often the case that these individuals are actually recruited from community pharmacy to go and work in a practice setting. And one of the questions that raises is as to why that's the case. We've also got the issue of retained margin. Now, this is something that PSNC has been wrestling with over the years in various different forms, and you've got all the threats that you can actually see there, such as branded generics, brand generic mix, brand conversions, including the recently introduced DOACs, CCG rebate schemes. You've got the general margin squeeze, and some of the initiatives you can see there are specifically designed to ensure that only 800 million of retained margin is delivered. You've also got the impact of global supply shocks, especially in the context of the pandemic. The entire system is based on swings and roundabouts. It is all around the low averages. And unfortunately, everyone can't beat the system. You've also got the issue around retained margin creating scenarios where leverage is all important. And that is often linked to estate size. So the larger players are in a much better position to generate incremental margin. Margin does not reward quality of clinical care. It may require an element of skill, and also it is linked to procurement leverage, but it does not directly impact on the ability to care for patients. It is a perverse incentive. So you can earn more margin, not just by dispensing extra prescriptions, but by oversupplying patients where maybe they don't need the medicine. And if community pharmacists are prescribing in such circumstances, as demonstrated by the Goldacre report, there is a risk of commercial influences. In other words, a pharmacist's tendency to prescribe whatever is most profitable for them, as opposed to whatever is the need of the patient. And the last area I wanted to talk to you in terms of threat to independent community pharmacy is the hub and spoke online. This is around large scale, remote, automated dispensing, which potentially can actually make the dispensing process more efficient, but equally would be difficult for a small independent to compete with. The solution that's proposed by the government to this particular conundrum is hub procurement. Under the hub and spoke model, the procurement activity of the spoke is effectively passed to the hub. So the hub carries out a competitive procurement on behalf of the spoke, but equally, it is then up to the hub to pass on that margin to the independent pharmacy contractor. And this obviously puts at risk elements of the 800 million retained margin, which is currently a key component of the global sum. Not only that, but incremental margins that are generated by hubs will be examined by the Department of Health. In the case of online, we've seen evidence of what some people call the cherry picking effect. Now, this is not a deliberate attempt by online providers to cherry pick, it's just the nature of the beast. In other words, the sorts of individuals that prefer to use online tend not to be high demand, complex multiple comorbidities. And this can result in a scenario where the high complexity cases tend to congregate in the pharmacies that are not online, that are actually bricks and mortar. And there are implications there for independent pharmacy contractors, especially the smaller ones. There's also the risk of missed clinical risk and red flags. So with online providers, and there's repeated concerns been expressed by GP colleagues that moving online risks the ability of clinicians to be able to detect serious underlying disease. Also, large automated units and large-scale operations tend not to be able to deliver longitudinal personalized care as effectively as a face-to-face model. You've also got, as a result of the move to online as a means of reducing costs, the risk of consolidation and competition, leading to what some might call the last man standing effect, where smaller independents effectively are squeezed out of existence, leaving the largest players the only ones remaining. So given all these threats to independent community pharmacists and the independent community pharmacist NHS contractor model, how does it survive? Firstly, it's important to recognise that the sector is no longer homogenous. There are different business models out there, such as DSP, such as the large-scale operators, and also the independent pharmacy contractor model. In this scenario, given all the changes that are taking place and the threats I've actually described above, the question is a one-size-fits-all contractual framework fit for purpose moving forwards? How do we, for example, accommodate the NHS's need to ensure safe delivery of increasing clinically focused services in a community pharmacy setting and ensure that the contractual framework appropriately rewards delivery of those services? Now, I've been asked to pass on that PSNC is considering an innovative solution to this as one of a range of options. So the model that Finn's going to explain to you in the next few minutes is something that PSNC is now actively modelling as a result of a summary paper that Finn and I presented to PSNC a couple of weeks ago. So now I'm actually going to hand over to Finn. Thank you for your attention, and he will describe how we think we've actually come up with a potential business model that will allow us to address the issues I've just described. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks, Andy, for the introduction and the opportunity to talk about this. And apologies, Gary couldn't have been here live. It just coincided with the break that he's away. So my name is Finn McCall, community pharmacist working in Prestwich Pharmacy in North Manchester. I'm also PSNC regional rep for the Northwest as well. So what Gary has indicated we're looking at is a registration-based national contractual framework, which will be based on zero margin-based supply as an alternative to the existing volume and margin funding framework. The new contract would be an opt-in or an opt-out for contractors, and it depends on their scope of clinical practice to be delivered. So what do we mean by a zero-based margin supply? And actually, critically, we would take the 800 million of funding and put that into fees. It is that simple. I know that is complicated in a lot of ways, but it is the simple change of being a fee-based service rather than a service that's based on purchasing of drugs. But we just can't put it into supply fees. we need to change those fees much more into a registration-based system. So it's like a capitation fee system for you would have for patients within a practice, and very similar to what the GPs have within how they operate within a practice. You would get a registration fee for a patient, which may be in the sum of, and I don't really want to quote figures because we need to model this up, but equivalent to a significant number of dispensing fees throughout the year. Why is that important? Because it then gives you the ability to flex how you would look after that patient rather than trying to drive volume of scripts for that patient. And it changes our incentive to look after a patient rather than to supply medicines as much as possible. So zero-based drugs margin, and you'll be able to buy the drugs at a cost price basis. All of the margin, the 800 million, would then go back into a registration fee. There would still be a separate fee for CPCS services and ad hoc service, but the vast majority would be in the registration fee. And why are we doing this? Because actually to try and make the act of supply a neutral act. So we're not making profit on supplying drugs to the patient, but we are looking after the patient. Why is that important? Because it actually mirrors the structures that the NHS has across everywhere else. It's how GPs operate, and it's how the NHS operates in hospitals. Services would be included to the registered periods, so you'd have the structured medication reviews coming in. Why is this important? Because properly to do a structured medication review, you're going to have to deprescribe some drugs. You're going to have to prescribe some new drugs, and you may well over time get into chronic disease management, which in itself would attract different funds and different fees for it. But we need to be in a way that we can support GPs managing patients. And this system would enable us to get into a GP diagnoses and the pharmacist treats with the drugs. We would have a separate fee similar to the single activity fee at the minute for non-registered patients. So if your practice is 70% acute, 70% registered long-term conditions and 30% acute, you'd still have that 30% of your acute fees coming into that. We also need to consider a self-care fund. So how do we do an awful lot of good work in supporting patients to get the best out of their own self-care, but none of that is paid for at the minute. It's all taken into this global sum, and we're doing it, we feel, free of charge, but we need to do it in a much more structured and formatted way. So we would be asking for a self-care fund for enable some of that. You say this is difficult to do. Well, actually, we can probably do it under the existing LPS legislations. So we certainly don't feel that we need a lot of legislative change to enable it. We do need some IT solutions, but already EMIST Web and Vision 360 have enabled those to happen within practices. And Gary's a perfect example. He's using the prescribing system within his pharmacy practice as well as within the GP prescriptions. Why is that important? Well, we get to see the pathology, the discharge information from the patients, and enable us to support better clinical decisions and recommendations for the practice. But it also enables us to flex periods of treatment. Fundamental question I ask to everybody: why do you want to give out 28 days medicines to a patient? We don't know if it will reduce waste, but we do know the more often that patient comes in, the more fees we get. But is it convenient for the NHS? Is it convenient for the patient? And should we be looking at something different to move this forward? Also, it enables the pharmacy to run electronic repeat dispensing as well, and ensure that patients are getting the medicines at the right time and in the right way. We're not wholeheartedly saying that this should be going out everywhere, far from it. It should be started in a trial model, and the dentists have done this already and started it up on a small scale. In fact, the dentists have run 2 models over the last 4 years and learning on how they can change it. Dr. Ridge is already asking for all new qualified pharmacists to have prescribing rights from 2006, so that's a given. This would enable them to start using it. It's not an essential criteria initially, but it would be a massive help for it. It is definitely only an opt-in or an opt-out. And if you chose to opt in and it didn't work, you've got the ability to opt out from it as well. But it depends on what you want to do within your practice. Do you want to be a purely supply function, or do you want to operate much more clinically? If you do want to operate more clinically, this is definitely for you, but we need to put a clinical framework in place for it. And it will need a national spec for pharmaceutical care. And it has to have the ability to adapt at a local level. PCNs will be focusing on the different areas as well as CCGs. With this, you'll get protected learning time for the practice to be able to deliver it. And you'll be able to change so many other different things with it. We also must have standardization of competencies to drive it forward. So we've got the same level of service right across the country to enable it to come out. What it doesn't mean, somebody, when I spoke to them about this recently, they said this is a GP Lite service. It is absolutely not a GP Lite. This is the enabling pharmacy to do the best it can for its patients and enable them to do it in a much more free way, but working as part of the system rather than in competition with the system. We don't need to do wholesale changes to the contract. We'd absolutely open it up as a trial model, as we said before. We still have to do different models of care. The GPs have been fantastic at doing online consultations over the last 4 months, mainly because they've been forced into it. But we've not picked that up, and we still need to innovate with the online consultations and even take it further and start to do some group consultations. It absolutely doesn't stop us having the incentive to supply. It's a must that we do supply to the patients, and I think especially for independents, we would continue to supply in a most clinically advantageous method for those patients. It absolutely doesn't preclude any enhanced private services. In fact, they would become more available within this service. And absolutely it supports the NHS vaccination service and potentially opens up a lot more for this as well. What difference would it make for a contractor? Hugely at the minute, and Gary's alluded to this already, there's massive variations for every contractor that's out there. It depends on what your doctor prescribes, whether it's generics or brands, whether it's 7-day, 28-day, 56, 84, even 112 days. Depends on if the CCG uses Cicato instead of metformin SR. Depends on whether they're getting rebates back on Seretide and all sorts of other things. This removes all of that variation from it and starts to enable pharmacists to work clinically more appropriate as opposed to just in a supply model. We'd absolutely have a positive incentive to reduce our dispensing workload so we can free up resources to spend more time with patients. Why do I mean that? But again, Mrs. Jones, if you're getting the same amount of money for giving her 6 lots of tablets every month, well, if she comes in to see you 3 or 4 times a year versus 12 times a year, you still be looking after her in the same way, or giving her the same, you'd still get the same funds for her, but by having her coming in 3 to 4 times a year, you'll get to spend more time with her and the team and how she's doing, how well she's been adhering to her medicines, what changes we need to make them better for her, to get better outcomes from her. There's been a lot of talk, and I saw some announcement today in the press about hub and spoke, and a new one being set up for independents. Critically, because margin is tied up to the supply of drugs, it's really difficult for independents to use hub and spoke. However, if you remove the margin conversation and certainly the variation in that margin conversation from this, then it becomes much easier to do it. We still got challenges around liability and how to progress with it with an IT perspective, but the biggest challenge we have for preventing independence for hub and spoke is margin. We've all been really worried about our income over the last 4 months as well. A model like this, actually your income's really predictable because your patients are stable. People have questioned why registration. By default, we already have registration, and it's grown significantly in the last 4 months as well, when we've got through ETP and registration for that. So your money would be coming in through the monthly on the number of patients registered, with the additional uplift for the activity when you've had single activity fees afterwards. But that makes it much more predictable and less manipulable by anybody else locally. All of a sudden, it's very easy to work within PCNs and work with your practice, because your key incentive is, because you're not making money from the supply of drugs, your key initiative is to help them reduce it. We can actually stop patients getting stuff that they don't need. We can help to reduce overprescribing. We can start to do switches to drugs that are better value for the NHS and better outcomes for the patients. And we can implement national, local, low cost of prescribing. More importantly, we can do de-prescribing for drugs that patients don't need, but they keep getting from us. All of a sudden, that changes the dynamic between the local practices, the PCN pharmacists, and the CCGs, removes all that tension and enables much closer working, and actually starts to open up different pots of money and work in different ways. Fundamentally, I think this is the bit that I like the most. I get to work much more professionally, and I get to work much more closer with our patients rather than worrying about whether I'm losing money on the supply of those drugs or not. So there's a huge lot of poses for this, but the patients are the biggest ones. Potentially reducing, saving damage and reducing over medicalization, absolutely critical. I've seen 2 cases in the last 2 weeks alone within our practice where we've had to stop patients getting medicines that they shouldn't have been on in the first place. Now that stops me from making money, but it's the better outcome for the patient. But I know of many more things we could be doing. And absolutely the fundamental bit of this, pharmacists have been poor. We've been really, really great at supply. What we haven't been good at is understanding whether that supply has made difference to outcomes for the patients. All of a sudden, if we're starting to work with patients to measure those outcomes and see how they get on, to feed that back into the practices, it closes a loop within the supply network. And when a doctor prescribes something and we've done a follow-up to see whether it's made a difference or not and recorded that, all of a sudden we know whether outcomes are coming from the work that pharmacists and GPs are doing together. Improved convenience and resilience and access to medicines. We've all been complaining about how lack of resilience over the last 4 months, especially back in March. If we were much more in control of it at that stage, then we wouldn't have been swamped the way we were, where all the doctors just went, oh, give them everything they need. So that's enough from me for now. I'm going to hand back to Andrew, but I'm happy to take questions at the end on this, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Finn, and thanks, Gary, for presenting a really interesting and different model. I'm now going to invite Richard Brown, to give us his vision and some of his opinions. So Richard will take about probably 10 minutes to do that, and then be followed by the recording from Jay Patel. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up a presentation as well, so just bear with me. Bring this up. Okay, you should be able to see that now. Okay, so I suppose I was asked to present around the key benefits and some opportunities that exist within the contract. And actually, if we start from my perspective as the Chief Officer of Avon LPC, I'm fortunate that I have some of the new pilots that are happening across our contract, in particular the GP Community Pharmacist Consultation Service. And I suppose it's just going to be useful just to talk you through some of my experience of what I'm seeing in the Southwest around probably the opportunity that exists for the entire sector of pharmacy, and equally getting, I suppose, as independents and small multiples, starting to get you all thinking about how you can best maximize the opportunities that exist within the contract. So if I pull up some ideas, and so for me, some of these key challenges for me, the large multiples dominate the middle ground. They have management structures in place. They are able to work with their pharmacies to get a level of consistency. And at this point, I should probably share with you all that my background is in field management with one of the large multiples, so I know exactly how multiples work. And it's a good system and it works across the board. But where independents absolutely stand to benefit is some of the most innovative service-based deliveries of contracts that I've seen across the whole of this profession comes from our independent sector. However, to counter that, probably some of the worst that I've seen comes from that same sector. And I think that's our challenge, is to how we step up as an entire profession to engage with the way that the contract is moving forwards and the opportunities that come with it. Because we absolutely need consistency of delivery. And that's probably one of the major criticisms that gets thrown at our profession, is that lack of consistency through our entire network. And that shouldn't be the case when we're all running on the same contract. I recognise that dispensing is still key. to pretty much all, if you know, all pharmacies, certainly the vast majority. And I don't make light of that within some of these things that I'm coming to suggestion. And it's really interesting to see the way that Gary and Finn are talking about some new opportunities and new different ways of being able to think about the contract. Because at the minute, as it's structured, it is heavily margin focused, and that's where the largest part of the revenue is generated. And understandably, that's where the vast majority of the focus ends up. So I do understand. We have to start to change the way we do things. So we have to start to find time to develop our teams, to train, to coach, to receive feedback, to upskill our entire population. Because the risk is, as pharmacists, we take too much of the burden on our own shoulders and we forget to maximize our entire team. And I suppose some of the key things I observe is that pharmacists generally tend to spend a lot of time worrying about what might happen. We worry far too much sometimes about the risks that might occur if we do something, rather than looking at the opportunity. Yet in some of our independents, they're the absolute reverse. They find opportunities where you would struggle to find them normally. And that's the brilliance, and that's what we have to capture. And if you look back across our profession, maybe over the 20 years that I've been qualified, I've seen a loss of some of that innovation that we certainly saw with the independents. And we need to find a way of reinvigorating that and bringing that back together. And often we fall foul of the fact that we sometimes overcomplicate things as well. And I suppose that's a real shame, because often with pharmacy it can be quite simple. We offer great service to our patients day in, day out. We offer fantastic outcomes, and sometimes we lose sight of that by wanting to make it more complicated than it necessarily needs to be. So I suppose that just gives you a bit of a quick whistle stop tour of some of the key focuses, some of the key challenges I think that we do have. But ultimately, some of the big ones. There are too many things that pharmacies do that we're not paid to do. And probably this is then our biggest challenge. And for me, this is when I go to see pharmacies and I talk to them about how they're starting to embrace new services that we have in the Southwest. I talk to them about the new opportunities that are coming with the contract. And I get the message back that they are too busy to do them. And yet they stand in front of 200 Dorset box patients, numerous care homes, whilst telling me that they're too busy to do them. And whilst I recognise that they're an integral part of the dispensing process, it sometimes astounds me that they have time and capacity across their team to do something that they're not paid to do, and that they probably, in all fairness now with the contract, are losing money on. Yet the things which are turning out to be fairly profitable within the new contract, they are turning them down because they don't have time. And I think as a profession, we have to start to reprioritise the things that we focus on. And like Finn said, actually focusing on delivering patient outcomes is often better for the business and is certainly better for your customers and patients. And ultimately where we get to with this is that pharmacies are now really struggling with the headspace to find the motivation, time and resources to be able to do it. We've got ourselves into this difficult place, like where Andrew said that, if nearly half the pharmacies in the country are losing money, it's unsurprising that people are struggling with this. And this is where we have to see some change and some leadership and some support. And I think that's where this ultimate question is should we change the contract? Well, my view is no, we shouldn't. What we actually need to do at this moment in time is for our leadership and our trade bodies to step up and actually start to provide that leadership to the entire profession to move the entire sector forwards. It's not necessarily just about moving independents forwards. It's about moving everybody forwards. We don't want to work like we sometimes do in pharmacy by dealing only with the lowest common denominator. We actually need to raise the bar of everybody, and we need to bring them all up. And we need to sometimes stop being independents or multiples. I get the fact that there is different financial models that underpin both of those. But ultimately, when we stand there, we all are providing services to our patients, regardless of the name across the door. We have to start to get community pharmacy to accept its role in community-based care. And I suppose in some ways, this is not about the number of items we dispense. I still find pharmacies will grade their level of performance in a week by how many items they do. We still use that as the measure of whether a business is successful or not. not the outcomes for the patient, not the service revenue that's generated, not how well your patients are cared for. We talk about the items. And we have to change that culture. And I think for me with the new contract is we have a huge opportunity within the new contract to talk about how many patients did you free up from the local GP practice? And why can't that then be the key proxy measure of the success of your pharmacy? We have to embrace technology. Often in pharmacy, we're very scared of embracing technology because somebody else might do it differently. Actually, you know what? People will continue to use their local community pharmacy if the level of added value that you provide means that they would not want to go anywhere else. So many things are moving online, and that's because they are transactional. Community pharmacy is a service-based industry. If you provide a high-quality service, people will continue to come back to you, and therefore embracing technology will only help and support you to deliver that. We shouldn't be scared of it because technology will happen regardless of whether we want it or not. We have to start getting our pharmacies to stop doing the things that we're not paid to do. And I keep reiterating this, and I reiterate this numerous times across all of my pharmacies in Avon, and I talk about it in wider afield because I do firmly believe this. We do too much because we're worried that somebody else might take the items from us. Actually, as a collective, if we all take the same stance over how we move forward as a profession, then no one person will take somebody else's business as a result of that. And that's how we have to stand together. Now, these are some of the key projects that I've had. I do have the GP CPCS project on my patch. I have PGDs that link in with it. I have pharmacies that are seeing multiple patients per day through the CPCS service already, and it's continuing to grow. We're in the process of rolling out the service to up to 50 GP practices across my patch, and it's a huge success. I have it ingrained in the CCG long-term strategic plan, their 5-year plan, and it's a key component of their delivery of care in the future. Where they see it going is that it's an important part of freeing up time in general practice to be able to move patients from secondary care establishments back into general practice, because they can't move those patients without freeing up time in general practice. And therefore, for me, the challenge I've set my LPC is that each surgery should free up 10 patients per day back into community pharmacy. And those services are then well remunerated for pharmacists to be able to do. But we can only do that if we can free our pharmacists up and our pharmacy teams up by changing the way that we work. Lastly, and this is key for me, is that there is money still within our contract. There are transitional fees. There are fees that are allocated to the new services. I think currently in this year, there's £223 million that sits within that pot. And that's where the establishment payment and the MUR money has moved into that line. The pharmacies that then tap into these new services stand to gain the best. And that's fine. That's their delivering outcomes. There are other services coming down the line, such as the discharge medication service. We have to be ready as a sector to embrace all of these services that are coming. And I appreciate for most pharmacies out there, they haven't experienced these services yet. And I suppose I understand the frustration that lots of pharmacies have because you just haven't seen what some of them are like. But I can assure you, I have seen them. They're really, really well received. During COVID, when everybody started dispensing items like crazy and services stopped, I had some extremely bored pharmacists because they were no longer delivering services. So they were over the moon when we started to reintroduce the CPCS service and the PGDs. So take it from me, there is huge opportunities in this contract. And the pharmacies that will gain the most from this will be the pharmacies that embrace those. So I would encourage you all to build relationships with your GP surgeries because you'll need that. Stop doing the things that you're doing that you don't get paid to do, and really be ready to embrace the new services when they come out in the contract, hopefully during the course of this year and as we go into next year. So like Finn said, I'm happy as well. Looking forward to taking questions from all of you about some of the things within this presentation and looking forward to chatting to you more. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for setting out the case, for making the best of the opportunities in the current framework. Really informative as ever. One of the things I've been reminded to ask is if everybody can, while we're listening, don't be frightened to put your questions on the chat box now as you go along, and we'll try and answer those. The panelists will try and answer those towards the end. So it's very interesting because one of the things Richard said, that pharmacy overcomplicates stuff. And I think that certainly we're going to hear a little bit about that from Jay Patel with his perspective. So that's coming next. So Jay will talk for about 15 minutes. So if we can run Jay's video, please, Simon, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Apologies I can't be there in person today. It's actually 4 years to the day that my dad passed away, so we are all having a family celebration at Mum's house. Drinks in the garden, bit of barbecue, and just a lot of fun family around us. So that's what I'm up to today. Just wanted to talk you through for the next 10 or so minutes, just my views and thoughts on some of the barriers and challenges that are facing our English pharmacy contract, and again also look at some of the opportunities that I'm seeing as well. So the first challenge I was saying is independence versus multiple. There seems to be a little bit of disunity at the moment. I think at the moment what's happening is that we are all contractors are up against it, and are real challenges for all of us. Don't get me wrong. And unfortunately, when things go wrong, we have a habit of wanting to kind of pass the blame, point the fingers at somebody else. And again, it's taking us back 10 years. So as a person who understands both the needs of an independent and the operational challenges of running a multiple, I can be really clear and level with you and say, look, there is more in common between these two types of contractors than there is that divides us. And actually, when you look at what is more in common then in comparison to what separates us, when you compare this to the real disruptors, which are Amazon, Pharmacy to You, etc., which are the real threat, we are aligned on so many issues. On bricks and mortar, on a local offering, aligned around wanting to give a personalised service and actually looking at service delivery. And if you want to draw some battle lines up, draw them along the lines of bricks and mortar local versus DSP internet pharmacy. That is not about independence or multiples, it's bricks and mortar versus pure play DSP in internet pharmacies. The second issue I'd like to raise and just address is this misconception that independents are doing really badly and multiples are doing really well. There are successful and unsuccessful operators at all levels. And even with the hub and spoke, right, let's not kid ourselves, the multiples are not making loads and loads of money. Their accounts are publicly available and they show poor results, which are demonstrated by their consistent layoffs, closures, and pharmacy sales. So if the multiples are making more money out of the pharmacy than the independents, they will be incentivized to buy the independents as they can make those stores more profitable, and instead the independents and small groups are buying pharmacies off big chains. Why is this? There are many independents who simply operate very, very well. So I've taken some of my businesses and sold them to an independent contractor who's absolutely smashed it to pieces incredibly well. Some of these cases I have joint venture schemes where I've sold the business to the employee and he still managed to put 10%, 15% items growth on there and smash out the cost of the bottom line there. They use price comparison software to maximize gross margin, and they have increasing cost advantage over multiples as pharmacy gets more complex. So what you're finding here is that we've got more complex operations at the moment, and the owner that is more closer to the action actually has more control over things like levy losses, claiming losses, script endorsements, all of those things there, has a lower labour spend, and actually that's beneath the line, even on the top end, a higher GP. And I've seen the figures, absolutely cast iron guarantee. I've done samples between day delivery stores run by a pharmacy manager and day delivery stores run by an owner partner, and it's completely different. So that's the first issue I'd like to challenge you on, independence multiples. Let's just put that one in room 101, forget about it for now, it's just a distraction. Second point I'd like to talk about is really new funding models. So there are discussions at the moment going on about big changes to the current funding model. Yes, I know there are challenges here. Things like moving away from supply to a service-only contract, moving away from margin to a fee-based contract. Now, my beliefs here are that these proposals will make community pharmacy less convenient and more prone to disruption, and I explain why. We've looked at capitation-based contracts in the past. I have one that we're running at the moment down in the southwest of England. GP registration is a pain, right? And that, because of the registration process, it means we put up with an awful GP service. So what happens is we are forced to register with a GP practice, we don't leave there, and they're not incentivized to offer us a great service. And then suddenly Babylon comes along and eats everyone's patients. So this misconception that they stole your patients, Pharmacy to You did not steal your patients. They chose to move to that particular model. If you look at the capitation models, like the GP ones that they have at the moment, they simply promote minimizing cost rather than delivering good service. So I'll give you a live example of this. During COVID, the GPs closed their doors, pharmacy kept their doors open, and the reason being was the GPs were going to get paid anyway. Pharmacy wasn't. So in some ways, actually, if you phone the surgery, will the surgery pick up the phone? Maybe not. If you phone a pharmacy, the pharmacy will pick up the phone, because if it doesn't, the patient will call another pharmacy and you've lost that patient forever. So again, some real assumptions that are there that need to be challenged in some sense there. GPs are inherently protected by politicians and the NHS, and they can get away with a capitation-based contract. They're not going to get their funding cuts, and actually there is a perception that GPs will always do the right thing in the interests of patients, not in the interests of their own selves. Whilst I admire that, and I think there is an element of that in all healthcare professionals, you've seen it time and time again, when the contracts go to the GP levels at a CCG level, funding goes to GPs, PCN levels, I don't doubt that's going to be any different. Services only, right? This whole idea of services only contract, the government really has an issue with this. I have an issue with this. With a service-based contract, the government has a cost plus funding model. It doesn't care if it saves £1 billion. Why are they spending? If the cost is low in some sense. So let's look at it. So it's irrelevant about outcomes. And what they do is they look at the costs and they try and fund you based on the cost itself. So if we go to a service-based contract, what will happen is they'll look at the cost and they'll say the cost is really cost of a pharmacist, and actually the pharmacist and the premises that it's in, and they'll give you a cost plus. And if anything, actually, what you'll find is it's actually going to lead them to actually thinking, well, why do we need to have the contractor? Why don't we just employ a pharmacist? Someone has a great idea, and suddenly you've got a pharmacist, not a pharmacy contractor, in control of stuff, which is great. Don't get me wrong, but it just means that we don't have a business anymore. I can see, and again, last thing is about GP collaboration. It is a good thing. Let's be careful though. I don't want to become their employees. I can see that this looks great. I believe it when I see it, but unfortunately, it will make things more disruptive. And it's based on some misconceptions or some assumptions that actually don't hold up in practice. We talked about margin and funding. We've talked about service mix. The last thing I want to talk about really is rebalancing the estate. Now, the challenge that we have at the moment is, let's be clear, there are too many pharmacies. I don't like the idea of saying that, but there are. And what I do believe is there are pharmacies out there that aren't delivering services in the first place. So there needs to be some rationalization of those numbers there. You can't protect everybody. I can't, and good contractors who are delivering services can't be held back by this perception that we don't deliver. And equally, we can't have a funding capped because that's the size of the cake. So, the size of the cake is set. We just need to, we need to actually look at how that funding is distributed and maybe look at less pharmacies. And I don't mean to be dispopular by saying it. I'm not trying to be aggressive, but that's just how it is in some sense. The third thing is about value, right? So value. The UK has the best value for money drug market in the developed world, even with the high shortage pricing on the current molecules. The margin system puts downward pressure on the drug manufacturers to keep their prices low. You can buy a pack of benzoyl for pennies. Now, I agree that there's some shortages here, but in a zero-based margin, the prices will rise. Now, in the main, the system works well to reduce the cost for the taxpayer. So the government aren't going to be in a position where they want to do anything which jeopardizes their position as being the cheapest cost developed nation on drug spend. Thirdly, about value is about goodwill value, right? So prices have largely remained strong throughout, as demonstrated by the Christie's data. Anything that risks losing the goodwill for an independent is a big issue. This is their asset that people have worked years for, it's their pension. So the challenge I'm having is a capitation model. What you find is it gives you less opportunity to grow, and therefore actually a fixed cost in there. And in many ways, actually, when you're looking at negotiations and you're essentially moving things away from margin towards fees, which is essentially what we're doing here now, the margin is much more harder and complex to attack. £2.8 billion pharmacy contract became £2.592 billion contract funding at a swipe of a pen. They can really cut through that funding and cut through the fees on there. We are not protected like GPs are. If you look at automation and hub and spoke, looking at this perception here about central fill does not mean giving power to the wholesaler. You've got new robots that are accessible for independents and local businesses. See MDS robots for less than £100,000, regional practice robots for less than £200,000. Independents and small multiples can quite easily set up localized cooperative hubs in the back of small garage units or in the back of bigger dispensaries and get to buy stock from any wholesaler to feed their machines. The NPA can actually get ahead of this and promote this. In Holland, that's exactly what they do. They've got large scale factories going on there. They've also got cooperative approach, and it works. Actually, in some sense, automation closer to the patient is a more viable, more flexible, and more robust solution. So you can't, it's not about you being pressed out of that. And then if you look again at that we need to make incremental improvements to eliminate variation in margins, right? I get that. And even at Day Lewis, we have a 10% swing between pharmacies due to brand prescribing, expensive items, things like that. That happens. But to an extent, this is factored into the price. And our lower margin pharmacies tend to be consistently low. We've got to be able to iron that out and address that. But, we can't necessarily disregard it. I want to talk to you about, just another view on things in COVID. And just really hits home here, right? COVID obviously has a massive impact upon the economy, but look at what it's had for patient growth here. Independent pharmacies, 3,700 of them, 11% patient growth. Large multiples, 4%. You are winning. We are winning. I'm an independent. I'm not a large multiple. This is just Boots and Lloyds and the big chains. Public perception has changed. There is this view that they want to be able to shop at stores which look after their staff. Community Pharmacy does that. Stores that support the NHS and the vulnerable. You've done that. We do that. Local versus high street, which is what we are predominantly, and small shops instead of change. Perception is changing for the consumer. So that's really important. And finally, I want to leave you on what I believe is a sustainable model, right? We don't need to make radical changes, but we do need to have some enablers to be able to allow us to operate a pharmacy better, which I believe this can do. So we have a patient, you have a pharmacy, and the patient comes in to see these people here. The challenge is that the patient can't get into the pharmacy. The patient is at home, the patient is on the go, and there are some small changes that you can make. So the first thing we need to do here is this. Actually, between the patient and the pharmacy, there needs to be an improvement in the communications. So small investments like investing in a phone system which has an answering machine or voice over IP that can actually allow you to put call waiting, call holding, all of those sorts of things there. When the influx of calls come in because people don't want to come into the pharmacy, invest in that. Small investment, it can work. Talking about video-based consultations, the challenge I'm having is there. We can't talk about whether we can do it or not. Get the bloody video-based platforms in the pharmacy. You need to have simple Skype, Zoom, whatever it is, start using it. Use it before you need to, because without the enabler, we're not in a position to do anything. What I'm seeing is the department is quite happy if we have the enablers to let us get on with it, but we're bickering about whether we can't, how we can't do it. Why can't we do that? Get some video-based solutions in place and use those. SMS. We launched an SMS service with patients. SMS them when their prescription is ready. They love it. They get the visibility that they'll get from an online order, and they get a chance of trusting the local contractor. They can get their family member to pick up that script. So messaging is a key component of that. Talking about online, there are so many app providers now that are providing solutions for community pharmacists. You've got loads of them. Use them. You can compete now. Video-based contracts, yeah, you can do that. Collection kiosks, that's happening now. We can adjust our model, and it's not rocket science. It's not huge things. It's small incremental changes, small enablers that you turn on that you can suddenly now compete, and you can compete with having a pharmacist that is there like you guys that will do anything for their patient, competing on service and making small improvements in your infrastructure. Not large-scale investment. This is not big stuff. Then the last thing actually is about rethinking about what we do. Yes, we want to have about services and supply, but it's really about creating a service offering. And my view on this is an internal view, which I'm happy to share with you. It's about the 4 purposes behind community pharmacy is what I believe. 1, diagnosis. How can we diagnose patients with new conditions? 2 is about treatment, treating people who are sick. 3, management, managing people on long-term medicines, which is actually the repeat prescription process. And 4, it's about prevention. What preventative services can you offer? It's not about products or clinical services, it's about the combination of all of those things in there. So the view really is getting good at management, managing people's repeat prescriptions, and then looking at opportunities to cross-sell them a preventative measure, look at anything they want to diagnose or anything that they need to treat, balance it up and scale it up. But really it's, we're talking about making changes. And then the last one actually is, what are the building blocks for success? The 4 blocks will be: 1, build a reputation. We're doing that. We've got a good reputation of delivering during COVID. The government loves us. Patients are respecting and valuing what we do. So reputation is improving. The second one is about relations. build relationships. Independent versus multiple debates and arguments, it's not causing any, it's not making any making anything any better. Get united as a community of pharmacies and we build a relationship with the government. The third point, education. Educate the commissioners and everyone else what we do, and they're starting to see that. But educate ourselves and get ourselves to improve our own offerings. And then the fourth one is capability, right? Having the capabilities to do things. You know, we can't complain about stuff, but we haven't got the capabilities. Get a video platform in place. Get an SMS platform in place. Get a, a phone system upgrade in your pharmacy. You know, workflow solutions, simple things like this make a big difference. It's about small capabilities, right? So I don't believe it's about huge sort of revolutions of the contract. It's about incremental improvement and fixing things. And we're really going to be clear that personally, if you look back and look at that model here, about how, you know, that's what I believe can work. So thank you for your time. Appreciate your, appreciate it all. And I look forward to any questions. Please do email me directly.
Excellent. That was an excellent presentation, Jay. Thank you very much. So we've heard some different interesting views, and obviously thanks to everyone for providing those different versions of the future. I think there's some intertwining of them as well that we've seen. I think it was Richard who actually said that we need some enablers. We need to join it up, and maybe we don't need a new contract. We just need to work around the existing contract better. Now, let's take some questions. I think I saw a couple coming through on the chat. Simon, we got one from Nilesh. It says, I'm not too sure whether Finn or Richard will take this, but Nilesh says, the zero-based margin model sounds great for those that are disadvantaged in the procurement process, for example, single independents, but some will opt in and some will opt out. Aren't there lots of problems with such a fragmented profession, such as how you split the 800 million? Should this new model be transferred to all? So no wholesaler discounts, no discount clawbacks. Richard, unfortunately, we don't have the service funded to make up for the volume. So do you want to maybe answer that between you? Who wants to take that one first?
I'll pick it up first. Thanks, Richard. It's a really good question, and that's part of why this needs to be modelled and why PS&C are taking on the idea of modelling it up and see what happens. We couldn't insist that everybody goes this way until we've trialled it and ran it and seen how effective it is and if it is protected. Jay has obviously made some challenges as to whether it's possible to do and whether we should be moving away from the existing system or not. Gary let out some real fundamentals as to why we need to change. Fundamentally, patients are being prescribed too many medicines for the wrong reasons. And if we stay in that giving volume game, we're on a losing hiding to nothing. But we certainly can't just blindly switch everybody away and take away the 800 million. It needs to be done in a managed way. So I think it doesn't necessarily bode well for just the people who are in who are losing margin at the minute. It bodes well for all those who want to get clinically involved, much more so, and be much more rewarded for working with their patients. But it's a very different model from what we're doing at the minute. It's an easier model to move to, but it isn't just about a high volume supply. Richard, over to you in the second part.
Yeah, thanks, Finn. So, Nilesh, yeah, I quite agree with you, actually. What you're saying there is that you haven't yet got the services available. I accept that. I suppose the reason why I wanted to come on and talk this evening was to present the fact that actually I do have pharmacies that now have the services available and they are starting to benefit from them. And it's taking time. It's taking that transition away from purely focused on the number of items you're dispensing and really starting to think about how you redeploy your team to be able to then maximize those services. And my pharmacies have had to go through a real journey. They've had to build different and greater relationships with their local surgery. They genuinely have had to stop doing things that they were not being paid for. So in all seriousness, for over a year, 18 months now, we've been supporting pharmacies and stopping doing things like dossier boxes and free deliveries. And it works. It has actually freed up our pharmacists' time and the team's time to be able to spend on some of these services. So absolutely agree with you. At the minute, there is not that visibility of those services across the country. And I suppose my role tonight is to try and say to you, there is opportunity coming, but your business has to be prepared for it. Don't just think when they come, you'll bolt them onto the side of your existing makeup, because you won't. You won't have time. So you really have to take quite a critical look at your business as to where it sits at the minute.
Wasn't that Jay's point that he was making, that actually you need to start, getting the video kit in now? And surprisingly, you know what have we been doing for the last 3 months? Oh, we've all been videoing each other. We've all been on Zoom. My 90-year-old father-in-law does FaceTime now. I thought that would never, ever happen. You know what? So all this talk about the elderly not being able to adopt technology, it's wrong. They do, and they have done with the help of their families and their loved ones. And I think, that what Jay said is absolutely spot on. So if this clinical model, Finn, it would be really a first anywhere in the world, and just about every pharmacy system in the world is based on margin. Isn't there a reason for that?
So there's a historic reason, but if we keep looking backwards and thinking, well, the way it's always been will be the way it always was, it's not going to work. I think the dinosaurs found that out. So, but I don't mean that in a negative way. We are the medicine experts. We're the drug experts. But at the minute, it crucifies our business to give out, to stop giving medicines to patients. So, and what we're proposing is you get paid a capitation fee for a patient to look after the patient rather than to supply the medicines. A supply of medicines becomes part of that process, but so also does enhanced pharmaceutical care. And if we look at some of the outcomes that they've done in the States from doing this, the return on the medicines was phenomenal from the stuff that Linda Strand has done. Now, the enabler, all we're asking for is an enabler to get to that, i.e., remove the incentive to supply and change the fee structure that we have into an incentive to look after the patients. But before, I just want to pick back up on the service question we've just had. We're about to go into the biggest opportunity for service delivery that pharmacy has ever seen. It's called the flu vaccine. And we, I believe, will be inundated this winter. So for pharmacies who are worried about not having services to deliver, try and prepare yourselves to deliver the flu vaccine this winter, guys. But you need to start preparing yourself today. Come off this call, go on to PSNC and the NPA website, start looking at the suggestions out there as to how you deliver flu, because there is a golden opportunity. Because I don't believe many places will be able to do the flu the way they've historically done it. And therefore, it's a good opportunity to get into services now. And it's not difficult to do. I think nationally, there was over 4,500 pharmacies that did it last year.
So we might digress a bit, Finn, but you might be aware why the government are really pressing to have the flu delivered early. I learned today, and I should know this, but the reason that they're really pressing for flu to be sorted by September is if the COVID vaccination becomes live and successful in October, November, then you've got to have a 6 week gap between injections. So you can't have a COVID injection 2 weeks after a flu injection. So you've got to have a gap. And actually what they're saying is to build up antibodies, you probably need a booster as well for COVID. So that's, I believe, why they're wanting us to gear up now for flu. So you're absolutely right. We've got this flu mountain that Matt Hancock said it's going to be the biggest ever campaign. And you're right, we absolutely need to be ready for that. But coming back to what Nilesh said, can there be two models working side by side, I think is also what he was saying. That,
yeah.
Because if you've got, and I'm just trying to operationalize this in my head, if you've got a pharmacy down the road that operates the model that you're suggesting, but you've got someone who's opted out, not far away, whose business is volume driven, relies on prescription volume, surely you're competing in that locality and taking business away from that other opted out pharmacy,
No.
or you're not?
Yeah, absolutely not, because if I go back to my daily practice, 70% of my patients who, in fact, it's been more, it's now 80%, are EPS patients registered with us and are on long-term medication. 20% comes in from the walk-in scripts, and they've dwindled because we've not had that much of acute care through COVID. But the vast majority of patients go to the same pharmacy all of the time. Okay, and therefore that idea of being able to have their fees in a year as opposed to the fees per prescription enables me to work differently with those patients. Now, the pharmacy down the road who still gets his patients on a single activity fee, a SAF fee basis, will continue doing that the way he has always done. Has the precedent for this been set? Yes, the dentists have been doing it in a different way. The two separate models been run over the last 4 years, trying to see how they change the dental practice system to try and make a better way for dentists to get outcomes.
Okay, so can you maybe answer some of Jay's concerns? Because surely there would be huge risks in moving to a capitation model, and you can see a big drop in income if you had the wrong mix of patients, perhaps. You know, some of the things that Jay was saying there, should we not just operationalize the contract we've got?
So we've been trying to operationalize the contract we've got for as long as I've been talking about being in pharmacy. But we should not stop doing that, and we absolutely have to iron out a lot of the financial ups and downs that are in there, and that has to continue to go. But we've not seen this model detailed up yet, Andy. So I don't know where Jay's getting the details from that says this won't work. So what we're saying is, and tonight is a great example of it. So there's two elements to see whether this works. Number one, financially, can we draw up a model that makes it work? And in that will be the risks that Jay has alluded to, but I don't believe they're anywhere near the strength he is. But the other question is, and that's why I'm asking the audience tonight, who's interested in doing it? So it's all well good me and Gary saying, oh, we will do it because we think it's the right thing to do for our patients. But the other bit out there, how many of the audience tonight would be interested in a model like this? And do they see that as the future for pharmacy? Okay, well, you've had a few questions. I'm going to direct a few to Richard, if that's all right, Richard. And again, I think you've just heard from Jay that he said, actually, oddly enough, contrary to what Matt Hancock said the other day, that Jay now believes there should be less pharmacies. And I think he was alluding to the standard of pharmacies that you alluded to in your presentation. Do you want to maybe just tell the audience how you see the transition to not necessarily a different model, but to how some of your more successful contractors have picked up the service that's being offered in Avon at the moment, which is obviously the GP pilot?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Andrew. So the pharmacies that have the best working relationship with their local general practice are the ones at the minute that are probably doing the best out of the GP referral for Community Pharmacy Consultation Service. And that's because the pharmacy team have to be trusted by their local practice. First of all, they have to be known, get that. But I have a 2-to-1 ratio between surgeries and pharmacies across my patch. So at any moment in time for any surgery, they will have a choice as to where that patient is going to get referred to. And yes, it's always the case that these things should always be based upon patient choice, but there will always be an element of skew with these things as well, we know. So the pharmacy with the regular pharmacist, the pharmacy with the best working relationship, and that transitional period has worked quite well for us because our pharmacists have now been freed up a little bit more. They're able to now go and spend some time with the surgeries. Some of my pharmacists are now actually meeting their surgeries via Zoom over lunchtime and are joining some of the lunchtime meetings. And again, we've made that happen across the LPC in the last few months just with COVID. So the key thing for me then has been is that key relationship. And unsurprisingly, in any surgery relationship between the two local pharmacies that they probably have, one of them is more dominant than the other on the referrals that it is getting. And that's not for the LPC to control in any way, shape or form. That's just local relationships. And what we've seen is that our independents have actually done very, very well out of it because in the main, they have regular pharmacists. And where they are, they've absolutely flown. Yet we have had some independents who just are not prepared to get involved in it. And then that just poses a real challenge for us, because their competitors will start to see more patients. So it really has been a real mindset change in getting some of those pharmacies to do it. But the ones that are now doing it are absolutely flowing with it. And the real key to it, like I said in my presentation, was that during COVID, those pharmacists were really quite bored, because actually they wanted to be delivering the services that actually gave them that clinical satisfaction. And if I can make it work longer term, my hope is that I'll also start to see pharmacists who have transitioned out of community pharmacy to maybe general practice. I hope I'll actually start to see them come back into community pharmacy, because it'll be a more appealing clinical-based role to come and do. So, I mean, that's a long-term aspiration, but that's how I'm looking to try and transform things that are in my local area. And whether that's then the right amount of pharmacies or not, who knows? You know, Jay made an interesting point with what he said within that. But I suppose at that point, at least if it's based upon outcomes, market forces prevail. But if it's market forces based upon outcomes and service delivery for your local population, that's probably better than just an arbitrary cut that the government tried to do a number of years ago, where we could have lost some of our best. So not down to me as to which ones survive and which ones don't. I just have to give them the best opportunity to survive.
No, that's a very good point. Very good point. Now, I'm not too sure which one of you wants to take this, but obviously the NPA represents members in the devolved nations as well. We can't forget them: Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And NPA members in Scotland actually seem to be far happier with the contract they have with the NHS than members in England. Have either of you any views on this, considering that the fundamental structure of remuneration and reimbursement is not that much different to England?
Scotland in theory is not that much different, but they're on a different journey, Andrew, and they've been given a lot of faith a few years ago, and the pharmacists have delivered that in spades and how they've done it. So they've got the faith through the minor ailment scheme, and then they've now moved into the chronic disease management schemes that they're working with. So while they're still ostensibly based on a supply model, and I absolutely can't challenge that in any way, they're moving into a different territory. And I think we're all on a journey. Pharmacy around the world is on a journey. And unless we look into adapt into new ways of working, if we stay on a supply-based model alone, we will really struggle. Pharmacy in Scotland has been given the incentives to change and adapt and deliver in a different way. And it's working really well for them. And more than that, I think they have a bigger shortage of GPs when you compare it to England. And so it's a slightly different position that they're in. They also have they work as a local health authority. They don't have the national NHS England challenges that the pharmacy in England has.
Okay, I've got a question for you, Finn, now, and it's from Elias. How likely do you think it will be that we could see a switch to the registration fees-based funding model that you propose in the not too distant future? So some form of timeline.
It's really difficult to say a timeline at this stage, because this is very early days in a model. It needs to be proven that it is financially viable for any contractor who takes it, and then demonstrate that it works, Elias. But I would be hopeful that we can get through that early day phase in the next 12 months. And then from then on, we might be looking for people to pilot it from then on.
Okay. And I suppose this other one is also from you. It's from Chris Martin. So I'm not too sure if he's the Chris Martin from Wales, or is Chris Martin who's going to sing for us. I'm not too sure. But from Chris, have you discussed your new proposals with your patients, GP colleagues, and the commissioners? Are they convinced your new model is what they want and fit for purpose? Chris is a supporter of the move to a more clinical services, but only when they are available elsewhere, so there are no inequalities. So how would you answer that to Chris?
Chris, really, really good question. So I've not discussed the detail of the model with the GPs or the commissioners, but I've talked about the principles of the model, i.e., the GPs struggle, and the CCG meds management in particular struggle with the conflict of interest that we have on making profit on supply. They don't mind us supplying medicines to patients, but they really sticks in their throat that we're making money out of doing it. And therefore, the move to the registration model is ideal for them. When I've spoke to my local GPs and the lead GP across my CCG in Bury, and we've talked about how pharmacy could support patients over a long-term basis. So picking up their blood pressure once a quarter, reviewing their inhaler usage through ACT and CAT scores, reviewing their inhaler techniques, looking at HbA1cs, making sure patients have annual foot checks for diabetics, those sorts of simple things, but they're not simple because they're not always happening with patients. They go, we would love you to do this. When can you start? And I'm going, well, I need to make changes to enable us to do that. So because the funding would come out of changing how we're doing it, but also the funding would come from restriction on supply. Our GPs, when we phone them up and say, you've ordered this omeprazole liquid, why don't you use the dissolvable tablets? And they went, oh, we didn't even know we could do that. It's a £7 supply versus a £75 supply. That's the sort of pharmaceutical care that we need to be doing. When we phone them up and say, this is the 4th month these patients have been on the steroid eye drops, do you realize you shouldn't be giving them to them? And they go, no, we don't. So we need to move to that clinical element. But at the minute, every time I make those phone calls, it's wasting my time and costing me money to do it. And that's where I want a model that we can do differently.
So again, just picking up on what Jay said, I think he said that the service-based model is a cost-plus model. So therefore, will the government just in the end sort of work out that they don't need contractors anymore because, we effectively at the end of the chain?
Andy, so we've had that story for how long now? And we had it whenever Pharmacy U first came out. What has COVID shown? It's shown that pharmacy with its open doors and the number of pharmacies we have are critical. Jay's challenge around we've too many pharmacies, well, that's not, I don't believe that is as true as it was. And certainly Matt Hancock doesn't believe that. So therefore we need a different model to see if we can do it more efficiently. Supplying boxes efficiently isn't good enough anymore. Giving better outcomes to patients through best use of pharmaceutical care is what pharmacy should be doing.
Fantastic.
Can I add something in support of what Finn's been saying as well? Because in Avon we had what started as a deprescribing scheme that rapidly morphed into a medicines optimization scheme where we reimburse pharmacies £30 for each medicine they actually stopped the GP prescribing. On average, we saved £100 a year per person, and the pharmacies were paid £30 for every one they were able to do. And in the first couple of months, over a relatively small number of pharmacies, we saved well over £100,000 of annual savings for the CCG. It just goes to show that actually when you really do start to dig into some of that clinical care that Finn is talking about, and you correctly make sure that the pharmacies are remunerated for doing it, the opportunity is huge. It's absolutely huge. But we are perversely incentivized, like Finn said, to not do anything about it.
So when you say, sorry, Richard.
And my pharmacists then spent the time liaising with the general practice, in fact, with the practice support pharmacist was the link in, to have their EMIS record reviewed or their TPP system record reviewed, to make certain that that change or that stock of medication was appropriate clinically for the patient. And then when that change was enacted, they got paid. It was a hugely successful project. And it really reinforces what Finn's talking about.
So if that saving was 100,000 within that system, is there a benefit share model that incentivizes the contractor who's actually going the extra mile to save that money? I mean, and actually the CCGs are benefiting. So is there a benefit share model in there somewhere, perhaps, Finn, that is part of this? To Richard's point.
Yeah, that's how we came up with it.
Yeah, and I think Richard's, and please, Richard, this isn't a criticism. It's a clunky way of doing it. Yeah. Because and I think it should be something we do as a principle, Andrew. It should be the way we operate anyway. We have, do we have the, it's not the right, but we're there to protect patients when we're checking dispensing. So if we protect the wider NHS in terms of the best value and the best use of money as well, then it should be a benefit share for sure. but that can come when we have when you've got a system that you're able to add those benefits back in. Because right now we can't do it. It's just defeating our own selves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, it's been a really, really interesting, stimulating discussion, and I just want to thank yourself, Finn and Richard, Gary and Jay, of course, through their video link. It's been great to hear everyone's perspectives on community pharmacy funding. I just want to wrap up now by actually sharing a few key statistics that came out of some of the research that the NPA launched over the last weekend. And it was an independent survey of the public, looking at their perceptions of pharmacy over the last 3 months. And it was really, really interesting. So in short, the public think that pharmacies have played a critical role during the pandemic, with 89% seeing their role during the crisis as essential. 55% have visited a pharmacy for medicines and healthcare advice during the lockdown. And interestingly, 78% of people think we've had about the right number of pharmacies. Some of you might have heard that Matt Hancock said, and I said this earlier, that the idea that we need 3,000 less pharmacies died the day he came through the door. Those were his words. And going forward, the public want to see NHS pharmacies play a greater role in healthcare. 78% valued the face-to-face relationship with their pharmacist. 74% want pharmacies better integrated with other NHS services. 84% say the NHS should do more to make use of pharmacist skills. And finally, 71% think pharmacies should expand their offering to take pressure off the NHS. So there really is much to look forward to as the sector moves forward in all the countries of the UK. And as I said earlier, the NPA is promoting the debate on the pharmacy contract, and it's keen to hear ideas, those we've heard tonight. But we will not be advocating change without engaging with our members and really testing the ideas. So we want you to get in touch. We want you to offer views or evidence. So please either contact me directly, or we have an email specifically for this point, which is independencevoice, all one word, lowercase, @npa.co.uk. And I just want to finish again, really, by thanking Gary, Richard, Jay and Finn for sharing their thoughts with us this evening. And thank you all for joining us. And special thank you to the NPA team that never gets seen on the screen. Well, you've got Simon's mugshot there, but Ashley, Simon, Kat, Rochelle and Christina and the rest of the NPA team for hosting. So again, much appreciated. And I think, I want to dedicate tonight, Jay said, this is the 4th anniversary of Kirit's passing. So yeah, I think our thoughts are with the family this evening.
Absolutely.
Thank you all and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.